The scent of ink and thick, cottony paper was Maya's version of aromatherapy. In the small studio she'd carved out of a spare bedroom, sunlight streamed across her drafting table, illuminating the delicate, swirling lines of calligraphy she was perfecting. With a focused breath, she dipped the pointed nib of her pen into a small pot of slate blue ink and drew a final, elegant flourish on the letter M. Maya and Mark. She leaned back, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across her face. These were the prototypes for her wedding invitations. Every detail, from the hand-deckled edges of the paper to the custom mixed ink that perfectly matched the deep blue of a twilight sky, was a product of her own passion. As a graphic designer, this was more than just a wedding detail. It was a labor of love, a tangible expression of the joy she felt. "I'm starting to think you love that piece of paper more than you love me," a voice said from the doorway. Maya looked up to see her fiancé, Mark, leaning against the doorframe, a playful grin on his face. He was the calm center of her universe, a man whose steady, unwavering support was the bedrock she had come to rely on. "Never," she said, her smile widening. "But it's a close second. Come see." He walked over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder to look at the design. "Wow, May, that's, professional." "It is professional. This is what I do for a living, remember?" "I know, but this is different. It's for us." He kissed the side of her head. "It's perfect. Your mom would have loved it." A familiar, bittersweet ache bloomed in her chest at the mention of her mother. "She would have," she agreed quietly. Her mother, a woman who found beauty in small, handcrafted things, would have adored the entire process. It was a painful irony that the happiest event of her life would be missing the person who would have been the happiest for her. This wedding wasn't just a celebration of her future with Mark. It was a way of holding on to the memory of her mother, of incorporating the elegance and grace she had embodied into this new chapter. And that meant every choice was deeply, personally significant. A fact that her stepmother, Susan, seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding. The planning session took place, as most family events did, in the sterile beige and white living room of the house she had grown up in. The house had once been filled with the vibrant colors and comfortable clutter of her mother's life. Now, under Susan's reign, it was a showroom for impersonal department store furniture, where coasters were not just suggested, but mandatory. Maya and Mark sat on a stiff, unyielding sofa, her design portfolio open on the glass coffee table. Across from them sat Susan and her daughter Clara. Susan, a woman who wielded a bright, brittle smile like a weapon, projected an aura of benevolent authority. Clara, her golden child, slouched beside her, scrolling idly through her phone, emanating a potent combination of boredom and entitlement. "So," Susan began, clapping her hands together, "let's talk themes. I saw the most marvelous idea in a magazine, a full tropical luau." Clara looked up from her phone for the first time, her eyes gleaming. "Ooh, with tiki torches? Mom, that would be so fun." Maya forced a polite smile. "That's a fun idea, Clara, but Mark and I were thinking of something a little more classic, timeless." She opened her portfolio to the mood board she'd spent weeks creating. It was a beautiful collage of textures and colors, the deep slate blue from her invitations, warm candlelight, trailing ivy, antique silver, and snippets of classic literature about love. It was elegant, romantic, and deeply personal. Susan peered at it, her head tilted. "Oh, it's very nice, dear," she said, the word nice landing with the impact of a wet sponge. "It's a little quiet, perhaps. A wedding should be a party, a celebration. This feels a bit like a library." "We think it's romantic," Mark said, his hand finding Maya's under the table. Well, of course you do, Susan said, giving him a patronizing smile. But you have to think about your guests. You don't want them to be bored. She gestured toward Clara. Clara has such a wonderful eye for color. What do you think, sweetie? It needs more sparkle. Like, a lot more. And hot pink. Hot pink and glitter. What a bold idea, Susan praised, her eyes shining with pride. See, Maya, a little pop of energy. We just want to make sure your special day is as fabulous as it can be. Maya felt a familiar wave of exhaustion wash over her. This was how it always went. Her taste was dismissed as quiet, while Clara's gaudy preferences were lauded as bold. It was a slow, methodical erosion of her own identity, a process that had been going on for a decade. Her father, who had been silently observing from his armchair, cleared his throat. "I think Maya's board is lovely," he said, his voice hesitant. Susan turned her bright, unblinking smile on him. "Of course it is, darling. Maya has wonderful taste. We're just brainstorming, exploring all the options to make it perfect." Her father, having done his duty, retreated back into his silence. The message was clear. A minor protest had been lodged, but the prevailing winds would blow in Susan's direction. It was Maya's job, as always, to navigate them. The real battle, however, was not over color palettes. It was over the one thing that mattered most to Maya: the location. She took a deep breath and turned to the next page in her portfolio. "Actually, speaking of what's most important to us, Mark and I have made a decision about the venue." She laid a brochure on the table. The cover showed a charming, ivy-covered inn with wide porches and a sprawling lawn that overlooked a dramatic, rocky coastline. "It's the Blackwood Inn in Seabrook," she said, her heart beating a little faster. "We're going to have a small, intimate wedding there in September." Seabrook. The word hung in the air, filled with significance no one but her and her father could understand. It was the small coastal town where her mother had grown up, where they had spent every summer of Maya's childhood. It was a place of happy memories, of salt air and wildflower-lined paths. To get married there, in a place so deeply connected to her mother, was the most important detail of the entire wedding. It was her way of having her mother there. Susan picked up the brochure, her smile tightening at the edges. "Seabrook?" she said, the name sounding foreign and unpleasant on her tongue. "That's a 4-hour drive, Maya." "I know, but it's beautiful, and it means so much to me," Maya said, looking pointedly at her father, silently pleading with him to understand. Susan's face arranged itself into an expression of deep, sorrowful concern. "Oh, honey, I know it does. But have you thought about your family? All of your family? My Aunt Mildred is 87. She could never make a journey like that. And Clara's cousins from up north, they'd have to book hotels, take time off work. A wedding should be about bringing families together, not making it difficult for them to attend." "It's not difficult. It's one weekend," Mark interjected. "And we were planning on keeping it very small." "Small?" Susan's voice was laced with theatrical disbelief. "A wedding is a celebration of community. You can't just exclude people. That would be so hurtful." She turned her full attention to Maya, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I just want the day to be perfect for you and for everyone. I would hate for there to be any unpleasantness or for people to feel left out." It was a masterstroke of manipulation. In the space of 30 seconds, she had transformed Maya's heartfelt, meaningful choice into a selfish, exclusionary act. She had made herself the noble champion of family, and Maya the thoughtless daughter. Clara, right on cue, sighed dramatically. And there's like nothing to do there. It's all just rocks and old boats. The country club here has a pool and a golf course. Maya's gaze shot to her father, her last line of defense. He was staring at his hands, his face a mask of discomfort. He hated conflict more than anything, and Susan had just manufactured a minefield of it. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Later that evening, after they had left the oppressive atmosphere of the house, Maya tried to appeal to him directly. She called him, her voice quiet and pleading. "Dad, you know why Seabrook is so important to me. It's for Mom. It's the one thing I really, truly care about." She could hear the deep, weary sigh on the other end of the line. "I know, sweetie, I know. And it's a beautiful idea. It really is." He paused, and she could already feel the but coming, like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. But Susan does have a point about her aunt. And, well, you know how she gets. She just wants everyone to feel included. It's a lot to ask people to travel all that way. "It's my wedding, Dad," she whispered, a desperate, hollow feeling opening up in her chest. "Of course it is, and we all want it to be perfect," he said, his voice taking on a placating tone she knew all too well. "Can't we just find something nice locally? For me. Let's just keep the peace, okay? It will make everything so much smoother for everyone." Keep the peace. The 3 words that had defined her entire life since her mother's death. It was her job, her burden. The peace was a fragile thing that could only be maintained by her constant, silent sacrifice. If she pushed, she would be the one causing the drama, the one making things difficult. "Okay, Dad," she said, the fight draining out of her. "I'll look at the country club." The relief in his voice was immediate and palpable. "Thank you, sweetie. That's my girl. You're doing the right thing." She hung up the phone, the silence of her apartment pressing in on her. Mark came and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. "We don't have to do it," he said, his voice fierce. "We can elope. We can go to Seabrook ourselves, just the 2 of us." She leaned into his embrace, tempted by the thought of it. But she knew she wouldn't. She was too deeply conditioned, too tired to fight the war that would erupt if she defied Susan now. She had been trained for a decade to sacrifice her own desires on the altar of her stepmother's happiness. The next day, she called Susan. "We'll check out the Northgate Country Club," she said, her voice flat and devoid of all emotion. The delight in Susan's voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just relief, it was triumph. "Oh, Maya, that is wonderful news. You've made the right decision. Everyone will be so happy." Maya hung up the phone. She looked at her beautiful slate blue design, at the elegant M she had so lovingly drawn. The joy she had felt just yesterday was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. She had given up the one part of her wedding that was meant to be for her mother, for herself. And in doing so, she had just handed her stepmother the keys to the rest of it. The silent burden was hers to carry all the way down the aisle. In the wake of her capitulation on the venue, a fragile and uneasy truce settled over the wedding planning. Maya knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had not bought peace, but had merely surrendered territory in a war she hadn't wanted to fight. Susan, now placated, became a whirlwind of saccharine helpfulness, her every suggestion a velvet-gloved command, her every smile a tight, triumphant display. The final 2 months leading up to the wedding became a gauntlet of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one a plausibly deniable mistake that left Maya feeling increasingly paranoid and powerless. First came the linens. Maya had chosen a beautiful, heavy linen in her signature slate blue. Susan, tasked with placing the final order, had somehow confirmed a shipment of shimmering, garish gold satin, When Maya saw the invoice, she felt a surge of panic. "Oh, goodness, you're right," Susan had said when Maya called her, her voice a tinkling symphony of feigned surprise. "Slate? Gold. The names just sounded so similar over the phone. My mistake entirely. But dear, the gold is so much more festive. It's a happy accident, really. It will bring so much life to that dreary ballroom." The order was non-refundable. The wedding would be gold. Then came the cake tasting. Maya and Mark had their hearts set on a delicate lemon and elderflower cake, a flavor that was light, elegant, and personal. Susan and Clara insisted on coming along. They dominated the appointment, loudly proclaiming the lemon cake boring and sour. They championed a cloyingly sweet pink champagne cake with a raspberry filling so fluorescent it looked radioactive. "Everyone loves this one, Maya," Susan had declared, ignoring the baker's polite attempts to redirect the conversation back to the bride and groom. "You simply have to think of your guests. It's the most popular flavor for a reason." They had bullied and cajoled until a weary Maya agreed to a single tier of her lemon cake, with the rest of the towering confection being the pink monstrosity Clara adored. The final, most cutting incident came via her best friend. Jess, as maid of honor, was trying her best to bridge the ever-widening gap. To keep the peace, she suggested inviting a few of Clara's closest friends to the bachelorette party. Maya agreed, swallowing her pride, and tasked Clara with simply forwarding the email invitation to her friends. A week later, Clara approached her at the bridal shower, her lower lip trembling. "None of my friends came," she whispered, just loud enough for Susan and several aunts to hear. "I guess they just weren't invited." The email, Clara claimed, must have gotten lost in her spam folder. She'd never seen it. The implication was clear. Maya had deliberately excluded her. The truth was impossible to prove. Maya was left looking cruel and petty, forced to endure Susan's looks of deep disappointment for the rest of the afternoon. Each incident was a single stinging drop of poison. Alone, they were explainable mishaps. Together, they formed a clear and undeniable pattern. Mark and Jess saw it, their anger growing on her behalf. But when Maya tried to explain it to her father, he just shook his head, his face clouded with a familiar, weary discomfort. "Honey, you're just stressed," he'd said, patting her hand. "It's natural for brides to get overwhelmed. Susan is trying her best to help. Let's not create drama where there isn't any." Being told that the drama you are drowning in isn't real is a special kind of cruelty. She felt utterly alone, her reality being systematically denied by the one person who should have been her staunchest defender. The message was clear. Her feelings were an inconvenience. She was expected to endure the sabotage with a smile. Amidst the chaos, there was one final element of the wedding that Maya guarded fiercely, one thing she refused to delegate. The seating chart. In the final days before the wedding, her studio became her sanctuary. Late at night, with the city quiet around her, she would light a candle, put on soft music, and lose herself in her work. This was not a task to be rushed. It was a ritual. She had sourced the most beautiful, heavyweight cardstock and laid out the design with the precision of an architect. This chart was her last stand, a final, defiant act of putting her own elegant personal stamp on a day that felt increasingly alien. With her calligraphy pen in hand, she lovingly wrote out each guest's name, thinking about their connections, imagining the conversations that would flow at each table. The last cards she wrote were for the head table. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She wrote her father's name, and next to it she carefully drew a single, delicate sprig of lily of the valley, her mother's favorite flower. It was a small, secret tribute, a way of saving her a seat. Then she wrote her own name, placing it right there between the father she still loved and the man she was about to marry. In this small ink and paper world, everything was in its right and proper place. The day before the wedding was a blur of controlled chaos at the Northgate Country Club. Florists scaled ladders, caterers bustled back and forth from the kitchen, and the sounds of a string quartet tuning up echoed through the ballroom. Maya arrived mid-afternoon with Jess, carefully carrying the box that held the beautifully calligraphed name cards and the large framed board for the seating chart. She found the venue manager, Brenda, a woman whose calm competence had been a godsend over the past few months. "Here it is," Maya said, a genuine smile on her face for the first time all day. The final piece of the puzzle.
Brenda looked at the elegant cards with appreciation. "Maya, this is stunning. You made this yourself?" "Every last swirl," Maya said with a touch of pride. "Don't you worry," Brenda said, taking the box reverently. "I'll set it up on the grand easel by the entrance myself. It will be the first thing your guests see." For the first time in weeks, Maya felt a flicker of real excitement. Entrusting the chart to Brenda felt safe. For a few hours, as she went through the motions of a stilted and awkward rehearsal dinner, she allowed herself to believe that the worst was over. She had to return to the venue late that evening to drop off the guest book she had forgotten. She let herself in a side door, the ballroom now quiet and empty. The tables were set, the gold satin linens shimmering under the soft glow of the chandeliers. And there, by the grand entrance, stood the easel, a single spotlight illuminating the seating chart. Her heart swelled. She walked towards it, eager to see her work displayed, to see that final beautiful proof that this was her wedding. She scanned the chart, her eyes immediately going to the top of the list, to the place of honor. She read the names for the head table. Mark, his parents, Jess, the best man, her father, Susan, and Clara. Maya's breath hitched. That wasn't right. Her eyes darted across the board, scanning the other tables. And then she saw it, tucked away at the very bottom of the list, on a small, round table numbered 19, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, was a card with her own elegant swirling calligraphy. Maya. The world went silent. The air grew thick and heavy, and a roaring sound filled her ears. It was her work, her design, her ink, her paper. But the cards had been moved. Her place had been stolen. She had been physically and symbolically banished from the heart of her own wedding. The violation was so profound, so deeply personal, it felt like a physical blow. "Oh, good, you're here." Maya spun around. Susan and Clara were gliding out from the hallway, their faces glowing with satisfaction from a final walkthrough.
"Doesn't it all look just marvelous?" Susan chirped, her eyes not on the room, but on Maya's face, watching for her reaction. Maya couldn't speak. She could only point a trembling finger at the seating chart. Susan followed her gaze and let out a theatrical gasp. She rushed over, Clara trailing behind her like a lady in waiting. "Oh, my heavens!" Susan exclaimed, placing a hand over her heart. "What on earth has happened? Clara, look!" Clara peered at the board. "Oh, Maya, no! On the eve of your wedding? That manager, Brenda, wasn't it? She must have put the cards in the wrong places. How could she be so clumsy?" The performance was so audacious, so utterly shameless, that it momentarily stunned Maya into silence. "Brenda didn't do this," Maya finally managed to say, her voice a raw, shaking whisper. "You did." Susan's face fell, her expression shifting to one of deep, theatrical hurt. "Maya, how could you possibly say something so cruel? After everything I have done to make this day perfect for you?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, soothing tone. "It is a simple, unfortunate mistake, that's all. But it's nearly midnight. It's far too late to fix it now without causing a huge, embarrassing scene tomorrow." She patted Maya's arm. a gesture of condescending pity that made Maya's skin crawl. "Let's not ruin this beautiful night over one little misplaced card," she murmured, her eyes flicking towards a beaming Clara. "For your father's sake, we'll just have to make do. I'm sure Clara will be a good sport and fill the empty seat at the head table so things don't look awkward." Make do. The words echoed in the silent, cavernous ballroom. Make do with a gold wedding she didn't want. Make do with a cake she despised. Make do with being a guest at her own wedding. Maya stood there, shaking with a rage so pure and cold it burned away the tears that had threatened to fall. She looked at her beautiful, desecrated work, at the smug, triumphant face of her stepsister, and at the woman who had so masterfully, so cruelly orchestrated her complete and utter erasure from her own life. This was not a mistake. This was a declaration. And it was, she realized with a terrifying clarity, the last draw. For a long, silent moment after Susan and Clara swept away, Maya remained frozen in the middle of the cavernous ballroom. The echo of her stepmother's parting words, "We'll just have to make do," reverberated in the quiet space, a final, condescending nail in the coffin of her own wedding. The burning rage that had momentarily flared within her collapsed, a fire doused by a sudden, crushing wave of despair. The fight, which she had been mustering in small, exhausting bursts for a decade, finally went out of her. They had won. She walked, as if in a trance, toward the seating chart. Her creation. Her work. She reached out a trembling finger and traced her own name, relegated to the table nearest the clatter and chaos of the kitchen. It was a physical manifestation of her role in the family, an afterthought, placed just out of sight, a problem to be managed. This wasn't just about a seat at a table. It was about her very presence being treated as an inconvenience to be minimized. This was her erasure, rendered in her own beautiful, swirling calligraphy. She turned away, unable to look at it any longer. She couldn't face the grand, empty room that was supposed to be the backdrop to her joy, but now felt like a monument to her defeat. She found a side door that led into a small, dark storage closet filled with stacked chairs and boxes of spare linens. She slipped inside, closing the door until only a sliver of light from the hallway crept in. She sank down onto a pile of tablecloths, wrapped her arms around her knees, and let the fragmentation begin. It wasn't a loud, dramatic breakdown. It was a quiet, horrifying implosion. Every sacrifice she had ever made for the sake of keeping the peace paraded through her mind, giving up the trip to Europe after graduation because Clara wanted to renovate her bedroom, handing over the delicate jewelry her mother had left her because Susan had insisted it would look so much better on Clara, and now sacrificing the one place in the world that connected her to her mother's memory for a generic country club wedding that had been systematically stolen from her piece by piece. She had given and given and given, and in return, they had taken everything and then punished her for not giving more. She wasn't a daughter or a stepdaughter. She was a resource, and now, on the eve of her wedding, the resource had been fully depleted and discarded. "Maya! Maya, where are you?" Mark's voice, tight with worry, cut through the thick fog of her despair. She heard Jess calling her name too. They must have finished with the rehearsal dinner. She remained silent, unable to summon the energy to answer, unwilling for them to see her like this, a broken heap in a dark closet. The door creaked open, and the hallway light flooded in. Mark stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumping with relief when he saw her. Jess was right behind.
"Oh my God, Maya, we've been looking everywhere," Mark said, rushing to her side and kneeling down. He took in her blank expression, the hollowed-out look in her eyes. "Hey, look at me. What happened? Talk to us. Jess's eyes darted past her, out into the ballroom where the seating chart stood under its lonely spotlight. She saw it in an instant. Her face, which had been etched with concern, hardened into a mask of pure fury. That witch, she seethed, her hands clenching into fists. That absolute monster! I'm going to go find her right now and— Don't, a small, hoarse voice said. It was Maya's, but it sounded alien in her own ears. What do you mean, don't? Jess demanded. Maya, she can't get away with this. She already has, Maya whispered, finally looking up at Mark. The blankness in her eyes was replaced by a profound, shimmering grief. She finally did it, Mark. She erased me. And then it all came pouring out of her. The story of the confrontation, the feigned shock, the gaslighting, and the final dismissive pat on the arm. She confessed the depth of her despair, the feeling that this wedding, this life, this family was a house where she was perpetually being shoved into the attic. I'm so tired of fighting, she wept, burying her face in Mark's shoulder. I just want it to be over. Mark held her tightly, his own anger a palpable protective force. This is not on you, he said fiercely. None of this is your fault. She's right. We're not letting them win. There has to be a way to prove it. We can't just let them lie their way through this. It's my word against theirs, Maya murmured into Mark's jacket. And my dad will choose them. He'll choose peace over me. He always does. There has to be some kind of proof, Mark insisted, stroking her hair. Something they can't deny. As he spoke, something Brenda, the venue manager, had said echoed in Maya's mind. It was from their very first tour of the country club months ago. Brenda had been showing the ballroom, pointing out various features. What had she said? Something about insurance. Something about—
Maya's head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes suddenly wide with a new, frantic energy. The despair hadn't vanished, but it was being pierced by a single sharp ray of an idea. It was a wild, desperate gamble, but it was better than the suffocating darkness of the closet. The cameras, she whispered. Mark and Jess looked at her, confused. What? Brenda, Maya said, her voice gaining strength. On our first tour, she was talking about the security system. She said, we have cameras covering every public inch of this place. We miss nothing. She scrambled to her feet, a frantic, fragile hope warring with the dread in her stomach. She said they miss nothing. They found Brenda in her small, cluttered office, packing up her briefcase to go home for the night. She looked up, her professional smile faltering, when she saw the raw distress on Maya's face. Maya, is everything all right? Brenda, I have a crazy, desperate question, Maya began, her words tumbling out in a rush. You told me you have security cameras in the ballroom. Do they record, and do you keep the footage? Brenda's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of understanding dawning on her face. She had seen enough wedding drama to recognize a bride on the verge of a true crisis. Yes, everything is recorded and stored for 30 days. Why? There's been a discrepancy with my seating chart. Susan, my stepmother, is trying to say you made a mistake, but I think she did it. I think she did it last night. Is there any way we could look at the footage? Brenda looked from Maya's pleading face to Mark's grim, protective stance. She sighed, took off her coat, and sat back down at her desk. Let's see what we can find. The security office was a small, windowless room filled with the low hum of electronics. A bank of monitors displayed grainy, black and white views of the country club's empty hallways, kitchens, and patios. Brenda skillfully navigated the system, pulling up the archive for the main ballroom and rewinding. The timestamp in the corner of the screen flew backward, a blur of numbers.
What time should we be looking for? Brenda asked. Sometime after the last of the staff left, Mark said. They watched in tense silence as the video played in fast forward. They saw the cleaning crew finish their work and depart. They saw a lone security guard do a walkthrough. The ballroom was still and silent, a ghost of the party to come. The clock ticked past 11 p.m. And then, at 11:23 p.m., a door opened and two figures slipped into the room. "That's them," Maya whispered, her entire body tensing. The footage was silent, but it was utterly, damningly clear. They watched as Susan and Clara crept over to the grand easel. They saw Clara hold up her phone, its flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. They saw Susan, her movements quick and furtive, carefully peel two name cards off the magnetic board. She held them up for Clara to see, and even without audio, they could see the shape of their triumphant smiles. Then, with practiced ease, she placed the cards in their new, incorrect positions. They watched as Clara leaned in, pointed at the chart, and let out a little bounce of excitement, a gesture of pure, malicious glee. Watching it play out on the screen was a surreal, out-of-body experience. Every lie, every gaslighting comment, every denial was incinerated in the face of this silent, grayscale proof. Maya felt the last vestiges of her grief and despair burn away, cauterized by a pure, clarifying fire. She was not crazy. She was not dramatic. She was a victim of a deliberate, premeditated act of cruelty. She looked at her family, her step family, on the screen, and she did not see a misguided mother and sister. She saw antagonists. She saw two people who had conspired to humiliate her on the most important day of her life. The fragmentation was over. The awakening had begun. Mark let out a low, furious sound. "That's it. I'm calling your dad right now. He needs to see this."
Jess was already pulling out her phone. "Forget your dad. I'm posting this on Facebook. Let the whole world see what kind of people they are." "No." The word was quiet, but it cut through their rage with the force of a command. They both turned to look at Maya. The tear-streaked, broken woman from the storage closet was gone. In her place stood someone they had never seen before. Her face was calm, her eyes were cold, and her posture was as straight and unyielding as a steel rod. The storm was no longer battering her from the outside. It was coiled, contained, and waiting inside her. "Confronting them now is what they want," she said, her voice even. "It gives them a chance to lie, to cry, to play the victim. We're not going to do that." She gestured to the frozen image on the screen of Susan and Clara admiring their handiwork. "We have this." She turned her gaze from the monitor to the venue manager. Brenda was looking at her with a new, profound respect. "Brenda," Maya asked, her voice perfectly steady, "can I get a high-quality copy of that clip?" She paused, a slow, cold smile touching her lips for the first time. "And is your AV technician for tomorrow's reception still in the building, by any chance?" The morning of her wedding day, Maya awoke before the sun. In the pre-dawn stillness of the bridal suite, she watched the sky soften from inky black to a pale, bruised purple. A profound, almost unnerving calm had settled over her. The frantic anxiety, the simmering resentment, the deep aching grief, it had all been burned away in the stark black and white truth of the security footage. What was left was not an absence of feeling, but a singular crystalline purpose. Today, she was not getting married in spite of her family. She was getting married in spite of their sabotage. And she would do it entirely on her own terms. When Jess and the other bridesmaids arrived, they found a scene that defied all wedding day logic. They were a bundle of nerves and excited energy, while Maya, the bride, was the serene center of the storm. She sat in the makeup artist's chair, sipping chamomile tea, her posture relaxed, her expression placid. "Are you okay?" Jess whispered, fussing with the sleeve of Maya's silk robe. "Like, really okay. You seem scarily calm. It's freaking me out." Maya met her friend's worried eyes in the mirror. She reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm better than okay, Jess," her voice low and steady. "For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what's going to happen. There are no more surprises." She gave a small, wry smile. I'm not seeking revenge. I am just enforcing a boundary. Firmly. Jess searched her face, saw the unshakable resolve there, and finally nodded, a slow, admiring grin spreading across her face. Okay, boss, just tell us where to be and when. The morning unfolded in a dreamlike sequence of rituals, the swirl of hairspray, the soft brush of makeup, the rustle of tulle. Through it all, Maya remained a tranquil island. She was not a bride bracing for impact. She was a general, preparing for a meticulously planned engagement. Her objective was not to destroy, but to liberate herself from the narrative they had tried to write for her. She was taking back the pen. A knock at the door preceded her father's entrance. He was already in his tuxedo, looking handsome but tired, the stress of the past few months etched around his eyes. He stopped in the doorway, momentarily speechless at the sight of her in her wedding dress.
Maya, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. You look just like your mother. The words were meant as the highest compliment, but they landed with a complicated weight. Her mother would never have allowed things to get this far. Her mother had a backbone of steel. Perhaps, Maya thought, she had just been a late bloomer. Thank you, Dad, she said, her voice soft. He came closer, his own obliviousness a shield against the tension in the room. Susan told me there was a little mix-up with the seating chart last night, he said, shaking his head with a sigh. Such an odd mistake for the venue to make. Anyway, she said you are all very mature about it. I'm proud of you for not letting a little thing like that upset you. Maya felt a flash of the old familiar anger, the frustration at his willful blindness, but it passed as quickly as it came. Arguing with him now was pointless. He was a man who had built a life around avoiding unpleasant truths. Today, the truth was coming for him whether he liked it or not. She simply smiled, a serene, enigmatic expression on her face. Everything is going to be clear soon, Dad. Just walk me down the aisle and be proud of me. Can you do that? Confused, but moved by the gravity of her tone, he nodded. Of course, sweetie, always. Walking down the aisle was an exercise in focus. Maya kept her eyes locked on Mark, who was waiting for her at the altar, his expression a mixture of love, awe, and steadfast support. He was her safe harbor, the reason this day was worth fighting for. For the duration of the ceremony, she allowed herself to exist solely in the bubble of their love, pushing everything else away. She was aware, of course, of the players and the drama around her. She could feel Susan's smug, proprietary gaze from the front row. She could sense Clara, standing just a few feet away in a garish gold bridesmaid dress that Susan had accidentally approved, radiating an aura of smug victory. They believed they had won. They thought her silence was surrender. Her calm was defeat. They had no idea. It was the deep, quiet breath before the plunge. She and Mark exchanged vows they had written themselves, their words a testament to the honesty and trust that formed the foundation of their partnership. As she spoke of loyalty and respect, her eyes flickered for a moment to her father, hoping the words might somehow penetrate the fog of his denial. The ceremony was beautiful, a perfect, heartfelt moment of sincerity in a day that was teetering on the edge of a great unraveling. The reception began as a masterclass in theatrical tension. As guests mingled during the cocktail hour, Maya and Mark watched from the ballroom entrance as Susan and Clara made their grand entrance to the head table. Susan, playing the role of magnanimous matriarch, pointed Clara to the seat of honor, Maya's seat, next to Mark's empty chair. Clara preened, accepting the undeserved placement as her birthright. The whispers started almost immediately. Guests would glance at the seating chart, then at the head table, then around the room, their brows furrowed in confusion. Isn't the bride supposed to sit there? Why is her sister at the main table? Her father, now seated, was visibly distressed.
He saw Maya and Mark making their way not to the head table, but towards the far side of the room. He started to rise from his chair, his face a mask of confusion and concern. Maya caught his eye from across the ballroom. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head and a reassuring smile. She mouthed the words, "It's okay, trust me." Bewildered, but conditioned to obey her quiet requests to keep the peace, he sank back into his chair, looking utterly lost. Maya and Mark arrived at table 19. The handful of her father's distant cousins, seated there, looked up in stunned silence as the bride and groom took their seats among them. "Maya, what on earth?" one of the cousins began.
"We're just visiting," Maya said with a charming smile, settling into her chair as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She spent the next 10 minutes engaging them in polite conversation, asking about their children and their drive into town. Mark played along, his hand resting protectively on her knee under the table. Outwardly, they were the picture of grace. Inwardly, they were winding a spring tighter and tighter, letting the pressure build across the entire room. The sight of the bride and groom exiled to the table by the kitchen was creating a low, buzzing hum of drama that was far more effective than any immediate confrontation could have been. Finally, the moment came. The DJ, a young man named Kevin, whom Maya had briefed the night before, stepped up to his microphone. And now, if I can have everyone's attention, our wonderful bride and groom, Maya and Mark, would like to say a few words. A polite applause broke out. Maya and Mark stood up from table 19 and began to walk toward the podium at the front of the dance floor. A pathway seemed to part for them, the guests turning in their seats to watch, their faces alight with curiosity and confusion. Behind the podium, a large projector screen glowed, cycling through a romantic slideshow of photos, Mark and Maya as children, their first vacation together, the day he proposed. It was all so perfectly, deceptively normal. Maya reached the podium, her heart not pounding with fear, but with a slow, steady, powerful beat. She looked out at the 200 faces watching her. She saw her friends, confused but supportive. She saw her family, looking concerned. And she saw the head table. Susan was beaming, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. Clara was smirking, whispering something to the best man. They thought this was her speech of surrender, of quiet acceptance. She adjusted the microphone, the small sound echoing in the now silent hall. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing all attention on her. She looked at Mark, who gave her a single, firm nod of encouragement. She took one final, deep breath. The distant war was over. The boundary was about to be drawn, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap. She leaned into the microphone, her voice calm, clear, and carrying to every corner of the room. "Good evening, everyone," she began. "Mark and I are so incredibly happy to see all of you here tonight." The video was silent, but it screamed the truth. The entire room watched, transfixed, as Clara held up her phone for light, her face illuminated in the grotesque, shadowy close-up. They watched Susan's hands, like spiders, scuttling across the seating chart, carefully peeling off Maya's name. They saw her hold it up to Clara with a triumphant flourish before swapping it with her daughter's card. The final, damning image was of Clara leaning in to admire their handiwork and letting out a little bounce of pure, malicious glee. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet, it was a thick, suffocating blanket of shock. The sound of a wine glass slipping from a hand and shattering on the polished floor at the head table was as loud as a gunshot. Every single eye in the room darted from the horrifying spectacle on the screen to the two women at the head table. Susan's face, once a mask of smug satisfaction, had collapsed into a canvas of ashen public horror. Clara had sunk so low in her chair that she seemed to be trying to physically melt into the floor, her face buried in her hands.
But the most devastating reaction was on the face of Maya's father. He was staring at the screen, then at his wife, then back at the screen. The decade of willful blindness, of placating excuses and conflict avoidance was being brutally, surgically stripped away. He was seeing his wife not as he wished her to be, but as she truly was. And the realization was shattering him. The video clip ended, and the screen went black. Kevin, on Maya's instruction, let the heavy, damning silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before a single spotlight returned to Maya at the podium. She had not moved. Her expression was not one of triumph, but of calm, quiet finality. She leaned back into the microphone. "So," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "as you can see, it was a simple misunderstanding. The head table was and is for our parents and our wedding party." She lifted her head and looked directly at the two crumbling figures at the table of honor. "Susan, Clara," she said, her voice devoid of malice but ringing with an unshakable authority. "I believe table 19, by the kitchen, is waiting for you. Please, feel free to find your correct seats. We wouldn't want to hold up the dinner service." For a moment, they were paralyzed, pinned in place by the weight of 200 pairs of eyes. Then, with a strangled sob, Clara scrambled from her chair and fled, not to table 19, but out of the ballroom entirely. Susan, her face a blotchy ruin of her former composure, stood up stiffly. She shot Maya a look of pure, undiluted hatred before turning and following her daughter in a hasty, shamefaced retreat. The sound of their chair legs scraping against the floor was the sound of a long overdue eviction. As they disappeared, Jess, her maid of honor, rose to her feet. She began to clap, a slow, deliberate, rhythmic sound. Mark's best man joined in, then his parents, and then, like a wave, the applause spread through the entire room, a thunderous ovation of support and validation that washed over Maya. Her father, his face ashen, did not clap. He slowly got to his feet and walked toward the podium as Maya and Mark stepped down. His eyes were filled with a terrible, dawning shame. "Maya," he whispered, his voice cracking, I'm so sorry. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I am so sorry." Maya looked at her father, at the brokenness in his eyes, and felt a flicker of the old, familiar pity. But it was different now. It was layered with the strength of her new boundaries. She reached out and touched his arm. "I know, Dad," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll talk about it later. Tonight is for celebrating." She kissed his cheek, a gesture that was both forgiveness and a promise of a new, more honest future. Then she took Mark's hand. At the same moment, the DJ, taking his cue, blasted a triumphant, joyful song through the speakers. The tension in the room shattered, replaced by an explosive, cathartic cheer. Brenda's staff, with practiced efficiency, had already cleared the 2 extra place settings. Maya and Mark walked to the head table and, for the first time all night, took their rightful seats. The rest of the wedding was not the one Maya had originally planned, but it was so much better. It was a celebration not just of a marriage, but of a liberation. The toxic cloud that had hovered over the entire engagement had been lifted, and what remained was pure, unadulterated joy. The first dance with Mark was not a performance, but a private, giddy moment in a room full of friends. The lemon and elderflower tier of the wedding cake tasted like victory. The laughter was loud and genuine, the dancing was uninhibited, and for the first time in a decade, Maya felt completely and totally herself, unburdened and unashamed. Epilogue. 6 months later. The Sunday morning sun streamed into Maya's studio, illuminating the half-finished calligraphy project on her desk. It wasn't for a client. It was a quote she was designing for herself and Mark to hang in their living room. "The truth will set you free." Her phone rang, and she smiled when she saw her father's name. Their weekly calls had become a new, tentative ritual. "Hey, Dad." "Hi, sweetie." His voice was warmer, less strained than it had been in years. "Just wanted to see how you were. I tried that new recipe you sent me. It was a success, mostly." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing and everything. He told her about the therapy sessions he had started. He and Susan had separated the week after the wedding. He never mentioned her by name anymore, simply referring to the past as before. He was slowly, painfully, learning to live an honest life. It was a start. Maya hung up, a feeling of peaceful contentment settling over her. She would never have a perfect relationship with her father, but they were finally building an honest one. She had not heard a single word from Susan or Clara since her wedding night, and she felt only a profound sense of quiet relief. They were a chapter she had closed for good. Mark walked in, handing her a cup of coffee. "Was that your dad?" "Yep," she said, smiling. "He almost burned the lasagna." He laughed and wrapped his arms around her, looking down at the work on her desk. "I like that one," he said, reading the quote. Maya leaned back against him, looking around her sun-drenched studio, at the evidence of a life she was building on her own terms. Her wedding hadn't been a fairy tale. It had been something far more important. It had been the day she stopped keeping the peace and started making her own. It was the day she had reclaimed her own story, and she knew with every fiber of her being that it was just the beginning.